Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Age of Druids, the Druids Brooch series number 9 by Christy Nicholas, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Late Winter, 442 CE, Lochri Ire. Her baby's screech stabbed through Cleanna's skull, making her want to abandon Ailirun and escape into blessed silence. She wished to be somewhere in the forest, on a hill, surrounded by buzzing bees and yellow flowers, perhaps flying over the rolling hills with a flock of starlings. Her brief ideal crashed when another scream broke through. She sighed and picked him up, rocking him against her shoulder while stirring the iron pot. Cleanna cast an eye for her middle child, Dawn, who helped a lot but tended to wander off and get into trouble. She found no sign of him, but someone yelled at the horses outside. He must be doing farm chores. Ailirun cuddled into her shoulder, letting out a wet burp, and promptly fell asleep, a warm weight against her neck. His hand curled around a hank of her black hair, pulling just enough to make her wince. At the same time, his adorable smile invoked her own. Despite her frustration, she loved her baby boy. It had been a dozen winters since her womb had quickened, but she'd been glad of the new child after so long, especially after losing one daughter at birth. Cleanna glanced out the window of the large round house. She glimpsed Dawn unharnessing the plow with practiced hands. Though he counted but 14 winters, he needed to be the man of the house since his father disappeared. The baby fussed again, whimpering in his sleep. She rocked him, still stirring the stew in the pot. They'd only a few meals of dried lamb left from the autumn harvest, but still had plenty of onions and turnips, as well as chives and garlic. At least O'Sheen left them a workable farm before he disappeared. She used to sell small wooden carvings she'd made, but who found time for such frivolity now? The odor of char caught her attention, and she cursed as she tried to swivel the pot off the fire. She needed to add more water before it scorched. Baby still in hand, she bent to the bucket, trying to lift it without waking the child. She failed. His scream shot right through her ears, a physical pain that made her drop the bucket. The water splashed on the flagstone floor. "Son of a diseased donkey! Cleanna, such language!" She whirled to see Ida, a blonde woman from the village, standing in the doorway, her hand upon her heart. "Sorry, Ida, can you help me for a moment? I need about 5 extra hands." "I can see that. Here, let me take the wee one." She reached out to take Ailirun, who yanked on Cleanna's hair so hard it brought tears to her eyes. She tried to be patient with her son. "Let go, Ailirun. That's a good babe." A crash outside made her whimper. Ida smiled. "Go, check on your lad out there. I've got Ailirun well in hand. Don't I, wee thing? We're going to get on just grand." She touched the baby's nose, eliciting a giggle from the ungrateful wretch. Cleanna gave them one last lingering glance before she rushed out to find what trouble Dawn fell into. The boy lay half under a bale of hay, struggling to pull his leg out. His face screwed up in frustration. Trying to suppress a chuckle, Cleanna lifted the edge so he could extract himself. "How did you get under there, Dawn?" He pouted, wiping straw from his lena. "When I brought Tin into his stall, he reared. I staggered back and hit the pile. The top one fell on me. It didn't hurt, though." Cleanna eyed the stack of hay, assessing the sturdiness of the remaining bales whilst trying to stifle a chuckle. "They look stout enough to me. You must have hit the bale hard." He didn't answer, but looked at his foot, shuffling it in the dirt. "Yeah, I hit it hard. Tin reared pretty high." Cleanna gave him a kind smile. "I suppose a full-grown horse rearing up high can be rather scary, even to a sturdy lad of 14 winters. I'm glad you were smart enough to back up. A frightened horse can be dangerous." "I know, Ma. Am I in trouble?" "Of course not. But you still have chores left. Can you fetch me 2 more buckets of water? He squinted at her. Don't you still have one? I just brought one in before I plowed. Unfortunately, I dropped that one trying to put more water in the stew. Oh, my stew! She rushed back into the roundhouse, but saw that Ida had moved the stew well away from the hearth. Thank you, Ida. I'm sorry to leave you with him so long. The older woman grinned, handing the baby back. He's been a lovely lad. I miss my own babies. They're all grown and starting families of their own now. Hopefully I'll have grandchildren soon to play with. Oh, that reminds me. I saw a trauma in the village. She said to tell you she might be later than she expected. Cleona frowned. Her eldest daughter spent far too much time with the blacksmith's boy, Tirishan, for her peace of mind. A trauma counted 16 winters, a marriageable age, and made her choice clear. However, the blacksmith would never pair his son, full of high status, to Itroma. As the daughter of a single woman with a small farm, they held very little status. A blacksmith stood second only to a bard or Druid, as he possessed the magic of creating iron. His sons could have their pick of any woman they wanted, but the father would choose the most advantageous mate. In the meantime, Itroma would only make a fool of herself hanging around, trying to impress the lad and possibly get herself a child in the process, none of which would increase their status in the slightest. She almost forgotten Ida still stood in her house. Her guest stirred the pot idly while Cleona lost herself in musings. After clearing her throat, Cleona asked, Did you come over to ask something, Ida, before I so rudely recruited you into an assistant? With a chuckle, Ida glanced up from the stew. I did, actually. I wondered if you would like to join me for the next meeting with the monks tomorrow morning. The monks? You mean those strange men up in the glade? Why would I do that? She laughed. Well, for one, you can bring your children. It might give them something interesting to do other than get in trouble. They also teach classes skills like beekeeping or baking. Cleona wrinkled her nose. I already know how to bake. You do, yes, but does Dawn, and being part of the community means you might have more help with the children when you need an extra hand. She glanced at the baby, now sleeping in her arms, and Dawn, who came in with 2 buckets sloshing full of water. He grinned at Ida and carried them to the hearth. With a glance at Cleona, he poured some into the kettle and swung the iron arm back over the fire. Ida glanced at him. Good lad, you'll make some woman a grand husband someday. While Cleona completely agreed, she resented the other woman saying it before she could. Dawn was her child, not Ida's. Her friend had raised her brood already. Cleona chided herself. The woman merely wanted to help, and the gods knew Cleona needed help. She hadn't enjoyed a good night's rest in moons, 5 to be exact, ever since Oshin left. For several moons, Cleona tried to convince herself his absence wasn't her fault. They'd had no argument. She knew of no other woman. No long-lost relative came seeking help. He'd simply gone out hunting one day. When he didn't come back the first night, she thought little of it. He often stayed out overnight, especially if he found no deer. By the second night, however, she'd grown concerned. By the 4th night, she'd gathered several men from the village and asked them for help. Together, they'd combed the nearby woods, searching for sign of either the hunter or his belongings. They found nothing. The best trackers in the village found not one clue, not even the trace of a footstep in the mud. Cleona even lost her last horse to the search when he got mired in a bog and broke his leg trying to escape. She'd loved riding that horse to escape life when she still could. That time was over now, with 3 children to care for. Speculation to his fate ran rampant through the small community. The most common theory was he'd been taken by the fairies. Other posited he'd just left to start a new life. He'd fallen into a bog and suffocated, or he'd hidden himself and laughed at them all for searching. He'd been fond of playing jokes on people, and the latter seemed plausible. However, as the season marched on and no sign of him appeared, a joke appeared less likely. Cleona muddled on as best she could, vacillating between resentment, freedom, and loneliness. At least he'd left her with a full pantry from the summer crop and dried lamb, beef, and fish from his hunting and fishing forays. He'd been a great hunter. His skill with the bow remained unrivaled, and he traded his furs and meat in the market on good days. Before he left, he'd taught Etroma to use the bow, and she possessed a great deal of skill. She'd brought down 2 deer this winter, which helped tremendously. Dawn would never be a great hunter, but he adored fishing. Between the 2 of them and her own weaving efforts, they survived the winter. However, she'd found it difficult to tend the house and raise the children at the same time. Perhaps being part of this monk community might help. She glanced at Ida, still stirring the kettle, waiting for her answer. What could it hurt to see what these monks had to say? Very well, Ida, I'll come with you tomorrow. When? Just after dawn. Dawn? That's when we milk the cows. The cows can be milked earlier, can't they? Just give it a try. There is a love feast afterward. Letting out a deep breath, Cleona glanced at her baby and agreed. The cows didn't mind being milked before the dawn. If anything, they remained more placid than usual. As the darkness faded, Cleona gathered her 3 children and trudged to the outskirts of the village. Etroma whined. Ma, where are we going? I told you, dear one. Ida invited us to the monk's house. They give some sort of lesson. She thought we would enjoy it. But it's so early. Why do we have to wake up extra early? Because that's when they do the lesson. If we don't like it, we can leave. Etroma answered the soul in silence. Dawn chucked her in the shoulder and grinned. Mornings are the best time of day, sister. Don't you love watching the sunrise? We always greet the dawn with Ma, anyhow. Yes, but that's dawn. This is before dawn. It's unnatural. Cleona hid a smile. Her roundhouse and farm stood some distance outside the main village, if village was the proper term. A collection of 20 families and a few single craftsmen clustered near a bend in the river. About a dozen more farms like hers circled the village. Past that lay a low, flat hill where the monks built their community. The river, which ran through town, eventually opened to the wide sea where Cleona had grown up. She missed the salt water and storms across the ocean. Memories of swimming with dolphins and sharks sometimes tickled her dreams. 7 monks settled in this area the summer before last. They built apiaries, planted gardens, and helped the people in the village with tasks now and then. Cleona's husband attended once or twice, but came back grumbling under his breath about dead gods, so he never went back. For Cleona to go without his blessing would be rude and unseemly. Besides, she'd never felt a draw before. Now, with Ida's urging, she'd pulled Etroma, Dawn, and little Eilerin in a sleepy string along the forest path toward the monk's place. Others met them on the road. A smile, a nod, but not much conversation peppered the pre-dawn light. The sun shot its rays up through pink clouds, but the chill didn't lessen appreciably. Her toes grew numb from the midwinter frost and now wet besides from the dew. This had better be worth the effort. At least 30 people gathered at the wattle and daub square structure. Most houses were round, but this one looked sturdy enough. It wore an odd little attachment on the chimney, like someone nailed 2 straight sticks together crosswise. The interior seemed dark, but it cut the winter wind. A small hearth burned near the front, and 2 braziers filled with glowing coals stood in both back corners. Near the fire, a small table stood with another pair of crossed wooden sticks. A monk, dressed in white robes and a colorful neck scarf, stood next to it. A few of the other villagers sat on the floor, so Cleona found a place among the left wall and did the same, arranging her children in front of her. As they waited for something to happen, Dawn poked Etroma in the shoulder, eliciting a yip of surprise and outrage. She shoved him back. Cleona whispered, "Quiet, both of you." "But he—" She held up his finger. "Shh! Ma!" I said, "Shh! Not another word." Etroma fell back into her habitual pout. Cleona tried to think back to when she'd been that age. Had she been so petulant and whiny? She didn't think so. All her causes had been righteous and worthy, or so she believed at the time. Her parents would likely have disagreed. Cleona remembered falling hopelessly in love at least a dozen times in those seasons. Perhaps being in love with just one boy at one time would be better for Etroma. It had taken a long time for Cleona to settle on one of her suitors, and in the end she'd chosen poorly. Oh, Oisin had been a fine storyteller and never failed to make her laugh. But as much joy as he'd brought into her soul with his tales, he'd abandoned them all with no word. Many times Cleona imagined what might have happened to her husband. Many times she came up with no answers. She'd even tried to ask the good folk a few times, but they either refused to answer or didn't know, or her offerings weren't enough to satiate their price. Their dissatisfactions sometimes became indistinguishable with their sheer contrary nature.